Hey there, my name is Brian Mendenhall. I am the worldwide head of security partners at AWS.
And I am Mike Massimi. I am part of IBM's cybersecurity consulting team, and I'm responsible for the global partnership with AWS.
Awesome. So, Mike, I guess just jumping right into this, we saw a massive trend in 2023 of organizations all the way from startup, SMB, mid-market, enterprise, everybody just rushed to the cloud, understanding the ability to save on their infrastructure costs with the use of containers and elastic environments, right? So as a part of that migration, foundationally, we have the shared responsibility model. Can you tell us just a little bit about what is the shared responsibility model and why is it important?
Yeah, it's extremely important. I mean, first and foremost, the shared responsibility model is sort of the backdrop of how any client is going to be secure in their cloud environment, because they need to understand that they have responsibilities themselves. It's not just the cloud provider. In this particular case, AWS is responsible for the infrastructure. They're not responsible for who has access to the data being where it's stored and if it's encrypted, and all the operating systems. Anything that has to do with the data typically is not the responsibility of the provider. So it's very important that a cloud responsibility model is understood from the beginning, that everybody knows what their responsibility is, and then they go forward, because together they can create a very secure environment for the client.
Absolutely. So there's a delineation of security of the cloud versus security in the cloud.
Correct.
And does that mean that the security of the cloud is secured, but security in the cloud is not secure? Does that kind of indicate that there is an inherent invulnerability or vulnerability of the cloud?
No, because every client is going to have different security policies. AWS can't be responsible for all the security policies for every client. That's why the client needs to extend their security policies into that environment. So it's not a matter of one being more secure than the other. It's a matter of the client having its preferences and responsibilities of its own security policies and capabilities and extending that into the cloud.
Okay. So say I am a customer traditionally had my storage, my goods in the closet at the office, right? I got my rack. I can physically see my email server. That's not going to cut it anymore, right? I have to modernize. I have to move to the cloud. Where do I start with my cloud journey and understanding this shared responsibility model of I am responsible for this piece, but I also have to get into the cloud? Where do I start?
Great question. It felt really good when you used to be able to see your data. You sat in an air-conditioned room on a platform and everybody was really comfortable with it. But that's not the modern day. The efficiencies of the cloud has driven this change, this transformation in the business. So where do you start? You need to assess your environment. You need to actually understand how you benchmark against where your security controls are today and how it would look within that security environment you already may be in. A lot of clients actually have shadow cloud workloads that they don't even know. Department heads have spun up different applications, testing environments. So that shadow IT element actually comes into play. So it's important that a client actually assesses their environment, understands their posture, and then they can take a step forward to understand, okay, if we want to do something in the cloud, we want to migrate to the cloud, we need to build a strategy.
Yeah.
These things are important.
Assessment, strategy, all right? I've got my roadmap, I've got my treasure hunt. We're going to go through the forest and the desert. How do I get to that endpoint? Where do I go with my strategy? How do I start? Do I start implementation? What do I do?
Yeah, so we need to, I've learned a lot from working with AWS, so thinking backwards, right?
Yeah.
What do you want to accomplish, right? So we want to have workloads in the cloud, okay? Who's going to have access to those workloads, right? And that's one way to look at it. Have a general idea. But you typically want to start thinking about all the different elements of that lifecycle to the cloud. So customers need to recognize that getting to the cloud and doing so in a way when an application's already been developed is sort of the wrong time to have a security dialogue. The right time to have a security dialogue is the beginning of that lifecycle, at the application layer itself, making sure that the source code itself is secure. Once the source code is secure, testing's been done, all the vulnerabilities have been vetted as best the customer can, they need to start thinking then again about the infrastructure side, okay? Securing that environment with the typical security capabilities around firewalls and intrusion prevention, all of those capabilities that you'd see on the network side, the infrastructure side. And then making sure that we have the network edge covered, right? For protection for that workload. Now that workload's going to be in a secure landing zone, we're going to have workload protection around that container wherever it's going to be stored, whoever knows wherever it is in the world, right? And then we have to have protections as it relates to that edge, right? So making sure we have web application firewall protection, DDoS protection, all of those elements in play. And then we need to start thinking about access to that workload. Access to the workload is important. Now that we have the workload out there, we want to make sure that the users have access to that workload in a secure way. But who has access is important. So identity and access management comes into play. And then having access to that workload and not allowing folks that shouldn't, and making sure that the security policy that you use to seek out in that air-conditioned room that's sat at in that glass fishbowl. Now the security policy actually follows the user wherever they're going. So it follows the user and finds wherever that user's going. They're going to that workload, the policy is following them. Typically what we want to see in that environment is a zero trust architecture, because it allows really the entire environment to be suspect, right? And because the policy is following the user and the user's now within that environment, everything can remain secured because we now have secure access to the workload, we make sure the right identity is getting access to that workload, and then it goes through from there. On top of that is making sure that we need to have the operations itself secure. Okay, we've developed an app, we've created a secure landing zone. Now we have it protected with firewalls and IPS and things like that. We have secure access, but we need to manage that environment in its run state, on its ongoing run state, to make sure that there's ongoing vulnerabilities, threat management that are detected so that the clients can take the necessary actions and avoid a breach at all possible.
Yeah. So when I've got my servers racked, I've got my applications in my rack, right? I can physically see the internet comes in at this point, right? I've got a cable that plugs into my firewall. Then I plug my firewall into my server, and then maybe another firewall, another server. That's my DMZ, right? So how does that apply to the cloud? Can I take my old tools, my old structure, and just drop that into the cloud? It doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way.
Okay.
Completely different environment.
Yeah.
So lifting and shifting you can't do.
Okay.
That's what works for the on-premise world is not going to work for the cloud. Okay. So that goes back to building that strategy, right? So making sure that we build those security capabilities for the new world order, like building out zero trust architectures. You don't need to think that way in the perimeter-based environment because that is your network.
Right.
Now you need to start thinking about zero trust architecture because it's the public environment.
Oh yeah, great point. So zero trust, the concept of trust but verify, right?
Yes.
So like if my kids tell me they did the dishes, I believe them, but I'm also going to check the dishwasher to make sure that it's been cleaned out.
Absolutely. Right? And in my household, they're typically not washed.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so tell me a little bit more about what is unique about these kind of like modern workload-based environments, zero trust being a really, really key part of that. What else is different about a modern workload that's different than like having my servers racked, my static environment in a closet?
Well, for one, we don't know where it's going to be physically, right? So it could be anywhere. And we also need to take in consideration that the application itself may be utilized at different times of the day by different people. It could be something that we're seeing compute power being utilized in a dynamic way. So it's not the old school world of plugging in a server in the LAN, right?
Right.
Those days are over, right?
Right.
So it's a dynamic cloud-based environment, typically consumption-based, right? So all those things have to come into play as it relates to the use of that application, how it's utilized, and then ultimately how it's going to be secured.
So, and then you mentioned one of the unique differences in these types of architectures, right? Is that you mentioned that the code is secure before it's deployed, right? So one of the differences is that modern environments are deployed as infrastructure as code,
Yes.
right? It's not a physical rack and stack with a plug-in type into a console. Rather, there is actually a development lifecycle that happens before infrastructure is deployed. Totally mind-blowingly different than old school infrastructure. How does security all of a sudden shift in that direction?
That's a great one, because the old school way of looking at that was, let's take an application that we really don't understand its security ramifications from the cloud,
Yeah.
and let's test it after it's been developed. Well, the easier way to do that is to provide secured by design capabilities, right? Built into the actual development of the code. And then, as you mentioned, you have the infrastructure as code is something that's repeatable. So that capability then parlays perfectly into that landing zone.
Okay.
And that allows this to actually allows the workloads to be migrated at scale, because you're working off a commonality around security. It's being included very early in the cycle, and it's not seen as an obstacle. It's an enabler. Now, one of the things that we've realized over time is that when customers engage their security capabilities early in the cycle of a migration to AWS, it happens quite fast compared to other environments, because of the delays you're going to see, because security was not thought of until the last moment.
So you're saying the overall life cycle of the migration will be shortened if you consider security at the forefront rather than trying to bolt it on in the back end.
Yeah, and then of course you have the inherent benefits of being more secure.
Of course.
Right? So you have the gift that keeps on giving on both sides of the equation.
So I'm curious, Mike, we talked about making sure that your infrastructure software development lifecycle includes security in the process and the result, the product of that. Then you have the secure architecture of what is being developed. Coming out of that, how do you ensure that when you operationalize the security, the infrastructure itself, when you operationalize security for infrastructure, that kind of resulting ongoing managed operationalization of security, how do you plan for that in the building and development phase? So if I'm a developer, how do I say, I'm going to build this in a way that we can do some operational managed services down the road?
Well, each one of these workloads are going to have set parameters on how they communicate to the rest of the operations of the environment that they're in, right? And set parameters will ultimately help generate what we would consider anomalies and events.
Okay.
Now, that can be part of the coding environment, right? So say, hey, when this application's working normally, this is what it looks like. When it's not running normally, there's some sort of anomaly, we may trigger that as an event.
Okay.
And ultimately that event may pile up. And that's where a lot of customers get stuck. Because you may have anomalies, these events that just pile up, but what's actually real? Is it strange that somebody accessed that application on a Sunday because they usually work Monday through Friday? Or was somebody trying to do something in a bad way?
Yeah.
Malicious. That's where event log correlation and threat management services come into play, because you need to make sense of all of those events, which can be numerous for many organizations, and be able to boil that down into actionable items that customers should say, hey, you really should be concerned about this behavior because this is what it spells, right? Versus scenarios that are innocuous, right? Yes, it's outside the parameter, but it's innocuous. It's not something to be worried about.
Right.
And that's important because you need to have an understanding of your overall threat posture at all given times. It's not something that you can just set and then just go on vacation and not worry about.
Right.
It's an ongoing world we need to be concerned about.
So making sure that when you're developing your infrastructure as code, that you have like triggers for anomalous behavior of the workload itself in order to enable threat detection and operations down the road.
Absolutely. It's all intertwined.
All intertwined. That's awesome.
And you could see how, if that's not included as part of the development cycles, how many of these things would be missed.
Awesome. So Mike, now that you have your security operationalized, you've got your secure infrastructure development lifecycle, you've got your modern security infrastructure for your modern workloads, and now you've got security operations supporting the overall infrastructure. What happens if something does go bad? Like if the bell rings in the night, if my pager buzzes at 2 a.m., what happens?
Call a superhero. No, really. So in IBM, we have an incident response capability, right? And we put customers on a retainer. And we actually will look after their best interests. So if something does happen in the middle of the night, we're actually the ones that they call, right?
Awesome.
We actually start going through, process of figuring out, what's wrong, that environment and then take the best next steps for them, right? There's a lot of different testing capabilities that we have that's part of that process. We have tabletop exercises. We help them build a response plan, which a lot of customers actually don't have, security response plan. So it's really important, not only to build out that security lifecycle and capabilities, but then also be protected with incident response. Now, one of the things that we also take in consideration is there's a multitude of different products out there in the marketplace. This expo hall is filled with them. And how do we make sense of all these different products? That's part of that building out that strategy that I sort of failed to mention was this understanding of what the customer's already invested in as far as their technology and what they could utilize from cloud native capabilities from AWS and what mixture would actually provide the best capabilities for them to be most secure as possible. And that's part of the magic, right? Because there's always going to be a different environment for a different customer based on their needs.
So it's kind of the old adage, right? Like failing to plan is planning to fail.
Yes.
Right? As long as you have the strategy part, which you talked about as kind of the second step of your migration journey, right? You assess, you strategize. That strategy piece is really that planning piece to bring together the entire migration lifecycle, right? You've got your secure development lifecycle, you've got your modern infrastructure with modern security controls, security operations, and at the very end, if things do go bump in the night, making sure you have the right number to call so that I can sleep in, right?
And your kids can do the dishes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for being here, Mike. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate your time, your partnership. Love the work that you are doing for AWS customers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, cheers.
Thanks.